In times of universal deceit, truth is the only rebellion left. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Everett Piper, and this is The Rebellion. Today's show is going to be about education again. Now, I'm sorry to double down on this topic as often as I do, but you're going to have to give me a little bit of slack. After all, my entire profession was committed to higher education, the Liberal Arts Academy, the Ivory Tower. And today I'm going to talk to you again about the downfall, the crumbling of the Ivory Tower, and how it's becoming the Tower of Babel, and why Donald Trump's action to eliminate the Department of Education is probably the best thing that he's done thus far in his second term as President of the United States. But before we get into that, I want you to remember that our sponsor for the rebellion is equippingthepersecuted.org. This organization, this ministry, serves the persecuted Christians in Nigeria. That particular country has about 90% of the persecution that's taking place around the world right now in terms of Christians being persecuted and martyred for their faith. And Equipping the Persecuted reaches out to these Christians and provides them with food, with schools. They provide orphanages for those children that have lost their parents. They provide services to widows who have had their husbands killed as the result of being pastors. And they also go into these villages in Nigeria and they teach these people how to defend themselves, how to secure their villages, and to stop the persecution before it actually starts. I want you to really consider making a tax-deductible gift today to equippingthepersecuted.org. One more time, write it down, equippingthepersecuted.org. So back to today's show. The topic today, I'm going to call it educating a nation of intellectual and moral imbeciles. And that's really what we've been doing for decades now in the United States. And it's all been championed and led by the federalization of our education here in the United States, here in America, by the Department of Education, which was founded by Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s. We didn't even have the Department of Ed prior to that time. A lot of people don't remember this, don't understand this, that the Department of Education at the federal level is really a relatively recent evolution of our educational program and our educational philosophy here in the United States of America. Prior to that time, it was all localized and it was all oversaw by local communities through school boards, parent-teacher associations and whatnot, the local superintendent, the local principal, and maybe the state that the school resided in had something to do with the educational curriculum and the testing and whatnot of that particular school. But the federal program didn't come into play until Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, established the Department of Education. This should have been abolished long ago because everybody knows what has happened since we started the Department of Education. Scores, standardized testing scores for kids across the United States have declined. So why keep doubling down on dumb? If it's not working, why continue to do it? And this is the key question that we should have when it comes to our public education system here in our local communities. If the federal control and federal oversight of education is a good thing, then why haven't test scores of our graduates increased rather than decreased? So this is today's topic. It's near and dear to my heart because I believe in education. I was a university president for 18 years. And prior to that, I served as a vice president of multiple different universities across the Midwest. I was a vice president at Grace College in Winona Lake, Indiana. I was a vice president of Spring Arbor College in Spring Arbor, Michigan, my alma mater. I served as the dean of students at Greenville College in Greenville, Illinois. And then I served as president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University for nearly 18 years. My entire life has been dedicated to higher education. I have 3 degrees, and I don't mean this to boast, but I have a degree in psychology, I have a degree in higher education administration, a PhD from Michigan State University, and I have a Master's of Arts degree from Bowling Green State University in student personnel development, basically human development theory within the educational arena. So I obviously care about this stuff. And I've told you before, I was a blue collar kid. My mom and dad didn't have high school degrees, let alone college education. But they believed in education because they recognized the practical value of getting a college degree, because it was your way to get up and out, to move on, to accomplish things in life that you couldn't accomplish otherwise. And when I went to college, that actually happened for me. God was used my education, the education that He provided to me. He used it to open up doors that never would have been open to me had I not gone and uh, enrolled in college and gotten a baccalaureate degree, a master's degree, a PhD. So I'm not negative on education, but I believe, especially because it's my industry, that I have the obligation to call a spade and to critique it honestly when it's necessary to do so. And frankly, education is failing America right now. It's failing your progeny. It's failing your sons and daughters, your nieces and nephews. You mothers and fathers that are sending your kids off to these schools need to attend to the fact that many of the schools that they're going to are failed institutions operating on a failed paradigm. So let's talk about C.S. Lewis. You know he's one of my favorite scholars. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, um, who was a professor of medieval literature at Oxford and then went on to Cambridge in the later part of his career. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, that you've read to many of your kids, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Silver Chair, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, etc., etc. C.S. Lewis, author of Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis, author of The Great Divorce and Mere Christianity. I want to talk about C.S. Lewis again today. More specifically about that book that I just cited, and that is The Abolition of Man. In 1943, Lewis warned us. He warned us that of a day when our country, and basically Western civilization, but he warned that Great Britain and America, that our country's educated class would claim that it made sense, that they would actually start claiming that it makes sense to what Lewis said, geld the stallion and then bid him be fruitful. Now that's the metaphor, the analogy that he used to describe what he believed was taking place even way back in the 1940s in education. And he wrote about it in The Abolition of Man. Now I'm going to repeat that. He said there's going to come a time, and it's happening right now as we speak. In the 1940s, when he wrote this, he said, we actually have an educated class, the educated elite, the professors, the administrators in the academy who actually think it makes sense to geld the stallion and then bid him be fruitful. Now, what was he saying? Lewis was essentially arguing that it was akin to removing the organ and demanding the function. To geld the stallion and then bid him be fruitful. Remove the organ and yet demand the function. And then he went on to talk about how we're creating an entire class of people in Western civilization, Great Britain, America, and whatnot, that are men without chests. Basically, he was saying we've removed the organ, the soul, the heart, the mind. We've removed the curiosity, the intellect from people, men and women. They've now become men and women without chests. They don't have a heart. They just have a gaping cavity in the center of their being where there used to be a driving force, a driving soul, something that was connected to the laws of nature and nature's God, something that recognized there was a truth with a capital T to be found, and therefore you get an education so that you understand it, you can pursue it, you can acquire it, and you can own that truth as your own. But Lewis said, our schools are now educating students to be men without chests, boys and girls without souls, without heart, without a basic common understanding of common sense and sense that's common. So he wrote about this in his seminal work, The Abolition of Man. And he accused the ivory tower of creating, again, men without chests, where instead of pursuing the truth, our schools would educate an entire generation of moral and intellectual imbeciles, amputees, moral and intellectual amputees with no understanding of the good and the true and the beautiful, the three things that are seminal and important and priorities for what it used to mean to be educated. Lewis predicted that there would soon be a time when the average graduate could no longer discern the difference between right and wrong, or even be able to add and subtract or multiply or divide. That day that Lewis warned of back in 1943 in the publication of The Abolition of Man, that day, I would argue, is here right now. We've reached that time, and we reached it decades ago. We just haven't woken up to it until recently. And because we now have an educational establishment, we now live in a time where students literally can't add and subtract, multiply and divide. They can't read and write and do arithmetic. They have no knowledge of American civics. They're ignorant of these things because we've educated a nation of intellectual amputees. We've removed the organ, and yet we demand the function. And this very thing, this problem is why Donald Trump's dismantling of the Department of Education here in the United States of America is probably the most important thing he's done so far in his second term as President of the United States. So, since the 1970s, I told you that the Department of Ed was established in the 1970s. If my memory is right, I believe it was 1977. I may be off a year or two there. Jimmy Carter established the federalization of education. And many would argue that's not even constitutional, that the Constitution does not grant the federal government the power to intrude into how we educate our children, that that's a local issue. It's not a federal issue. It's a state issue. It's a township issue. It's a local issue between parents, their children, and their local communities and how they want their kids to be educated and trained, become productive citizens, American citizens. So since the 1970s, the Department of Ed and it has failed. It's failed our nation's schools and our students. Year after year, we've elevated social engineering and political indoctrination over teaching the basics of reading and writing and arithmetic and of personal virtue. Now, I'm going to repeat that again. The basics used to be we're going to teach our kids how to read, how to write, and how to add and subtract, multiply and divide, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we taught them the importance of personal virtue. We taught them the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, up and down, black and white, etc. We don't do that anymore. Decade after decade, we've promoted students from one grade level to the next, not because of academic achievement in reading, writing, arithmetic, or personal virtue, or understanding of American civics. We don't move them from one grade to the next because they've achieved anything academically in those given areas. No, we just treat them like helicopter parents treat their children, give them a participation trophy. We don't want them to fail. We don't want them to get a bad grade, so we give them a participation trophy. It's called a high school diploma, and we move them on even though they can't even perform at basic grade level in those standard basic things like reading, writing, arithmetic. And when it comes to personal virtue, we don't even talk about it anymore. We don't teach it anymore. In fact, if we do anything, we disparage it and elevate radical relativism above the reality of what's right and wrong, the personal virtues of what makes a virtuous man, a virtuous woman, and leads to a virtuous society, country, and culture. So again, that day is here. That day that Lewis warned of creating men and women, boys and girls without chests, without a soul, of removing the organ and yet demanding the function, of creating moral and intellectual amputees, that day is here. So, because we give our kids participation trophies, i.e., we say you've earned a degree, you've earned a diploma, we're going to give you this diploma, even though all of the data tells us these kids are not performing They're not performing at the level they should, that would warrant a diploma or a graduation or the right to move from, or the privilege to move from one grade level to the next, or to graduate from junior high or to graduate from high school and then move on. They're not performing at that level. Um, and the result of all this, like I've said, is a morally a morally vacuous citizenry that cannot read, they cannot write, they don't understand the basics of logic and science, and they can't tell you why it's wrong to force girls to undress in front of boys in the girls' locker room. This story that so recently came out of Deerfield, Illinois, where you have teachers and administrators in the girls' locker room forcing girls to undress in the locker room in front of a boy who claims to be a trans girl. This is an upside down world. So again, we're educating people to not be able to read, to write, to add, subtract. They can't do reading, writing, and arithmetic at grade level. We're graduating them. They go to college. They get degrees in education. They go back to your local schools. And because they don't know how to do basic academic work, and now they have a college degree, and they have never been taught or trained in logic or in moral behavior, what it means to be a virtuous human being, they can't even tell you that it's wrong to force a girl to undress in front of a boy in a girl's locker room. This is a mess. It's a total mess, and this is coming out of our public schools. Now, you might say, aren't you exaggerating? Is the performance level as bad as you are saying it is? Well, let's go to the national report card. This is a national assessment of our students' academic performance. It's been around for decades. And the national report card actually is called the nation's report card. The nation's report card in 2024, the most recent one that we have, according to that 2024 nation's report card, fewer than a third of our students nationwide were proficient. I'll say it again. Fewer than a third of our students nationwide are proficient in reading. In other words, fewer than a third can read at grade level. Fewer than a third. Fewer than a third. We don't have a third of our students that can read at grade level. That's the nation's report card 2024. And only 40% performed math at grade level. So you've got fewer than a third that can read proficiently, and you have 40% and no more that can perform math at grade level. And nearly a quarter of the students were unable to identify odd numbers or solve a problem using unit conversions. This is basic elementary stuff, but yet we don't have students that can do it. So you tell me that your local public schools are doing a good job. The bottom line is they're not. And if you say, oh, this isn't true of my local school, go look at your performance levels at your local school, and you're going to find out that it's basically average, meaning it is average with regard to the performance that's being reported on the nation's report card. So I'm going to repeat this. You have fewer than a third of our students nationwide who are proficient in reading. Only 40% performed math at grade level, with nearly a quarter unable to identify odd numbers or solve problems using unit conversions. But despite these terrible scores, graduation rates continue to rise. So you've got students that can't read or do math, but yet our graduation rates rise. Does this seem odd? What this means is we have a generation of young people where we've severed the organ, but we demand the function, like I've said multiple times already. It's a society with no understanding of a social compact, a workforce without the skills to work, and an electorate with no clear moral code. So we have essentially become a crippled nation because our schools are failing us. They're severing the organ, demanding the function. They're cutting off the arm and saying, go play ball. They're They're plucking out the eyes and saying, go read a book. These are graphic analogies, but it's essentially what Lewis was warning of. You create men without chests. You remove the heart and yet demand the person to perform. When you remove a person's soul, don't expect them to be a virtuous human being. The problem here, let's just cut to the chase. The problem is this. It's not a lack of money. We're spending more than we ever have before. The problem is that we've abandoned the good ideas of teaching students how to read and write and count and know the difference between right and wrong. And we've replaced those good ideas with the bad ideas of, here it comes, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, critical race theory, CRT, LGBTQIA, radical sexual identity claims, and the moral nihilism that comes with it, Black Lives Matter, BLM, social justice warriors, SJW, and social emotional learning, SEL. So we've replaced the good ideas of teaching students how to read and write and count and understand the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. And we've replaced those good ideas because we've stopped teaching them with what? We filled the vacuum with the alphabet soup nonsense of CRT, DEI, LGBTQIA, BLM, SJW, and SEL, and more. That's what we're teaching. Oh, they feel great about themselves because we teach self-actualization and positive reinforcement, and we give them participation trophies even when they're not performing well. Oh, they feel good about themselves, but they can't tell you what 2 plus 2 is. In fact, there are times when they're being taught by teachers that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is nothing but the product of white privilege. That's actually being taught. There's a teacher in Boston that's been called out for saying 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a product of white privilege because it's rational, it's conclusive, it's absolute. And rational, conclusive, absolute concepts are racist. They're the products of white privilege. Again, if you think this isn't being taught in your local school, you better do your homework. You better go check because I'll bet your bottom dollar it is, or at least some portion of this is being taught. I don't care where you are, whether you're in Oklahoma, Ohio, Michigan, or whatnot. It is being taught. Why? Because the teachers have degrees from these universities that teach this stuff and have made this their educational paradigm for decades. So, bad ideas, I'm going to repeat my mantra that I've used multiple times on this show. Ideas always have consequences. Good ideas, good culture, good kids, good community, good college, good county, good city, good church. Good ideas result in good behavior. But bad ideas are going to result in the opposite. Bad church, bad community, bad country, bad kids. And when you teach bad ideas, they will bear fruit. And that's what we're doing right now. They will bear fruit. Just as surely as an acorn is going to grow an oak tree or a hurricane will bring a flood. There will be consequences. Good ideas, good consequences, bad ideas, bad consequences. So let me give you some examples. Why would you expect decades of teaching sexual promiscuity in our schools to result in sexual restraint in our students? Stop and think about it. When you're teaching young boys how to use a condom rather than the 10 Commandments, what do you think they're going to do? So again, why would you expect teaching sexual promiscuity is going to result in sexual restraint in your students? Ideas have consequences. And why are you surprised? Why are you surprised at the selfishness of our culture when our schools teach self-esteem more effectively than they do mathematics, science, and civics? Well, is there something wrong with self-esteem? Well, if that's all you're teaching, yes. If you're teaching them to feel good about the fact that they can't count, they can't add, they can't subtract, they can't multiply, they can't divide, they can't read, they can't write, and they can't think rationally because they haven't been taught the basics of logic. If you haven't taught them why America is exceptional rather than constantly berating them with why America is bad, what do you think you're going to get? What do you think you're going to get? The outcome is very predictable. You're going to get a self-absorbed, narcissistic culture that thinks it's right all the time, and history can be damned. It doesn't matter what the founding fathers thought or taught or wrote. We don't need to pay attention to that because we feel good about ourselves and we know more than they did. That's where we are, and it's being taught in your local school. And why would you possibly think that teaching values clarification rather than moral absolutes would produce a virtuous people? Your curriculum is loaded with values clarification and moral absolutes. Well, nothing is absolute, and that's absolute. The self-refuting nonsense of relativism. Everything's relative except what I just said, which is not a relative statement. It's an absolute statement, but there's nothing that's absolute. This is really the absurdity of what your students are being taught. And where in the annals of all of human history is there any evidence that the subordination of one person's right to live to another person's right to choose ever resulted in the protection of every person's unalienable right to life? Obviously, I'm hitting on the abortion issue here. If you change it from abortion to right to choose, so it's not abortion any longer, it's a choice, and you're going to subordinate that person's right to live, that infant's right to live, you're going to subordinate that right to your right to choose, and you think this is going to result in every person's right to live, the respect for every person's unalienable right to life? This isn't going to work. And it's becoming very clear what the consequences of this broken idea are in our culture. And why would you think that our young people would be able to read and do basic calculations when we've replaced the common sense of phonics and physics with the convoluted mess of Common Core? I could go on and on. The list is endless. But the bottom line is this. I would argue the evidence is very, very clear. All you need to do is turn on the nightly news to see the proof. The Department of Education has given us a nation of men without chests, where our progeny can't tell us why men and women, our progeny can't tell us why men aren't women or why women aren't men. And they can't tell us why 2 + 2 = 4 is not a product of white privilege. They can't. They can't. Education will always lead somewhere. Always. It'll either lead toward the liberty that's found in that which is right and just and real, or toward the slavery and ugly hell created by our own arrogance and dysfunction. I'm going to say that again. Education is always going to lead somewhere. It's either going to lead toward the liberty found in that which is right and just and real, or toward the ugly hell and slavery created by our own arrogance and dysfunction. So more from C.S. Lewis as I get ready to wrap this one up. He said this: all our life long, we are slowly turning into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature, either into one who is in harmony with God or one that is in a state of war and hatred with God. To be one kind of creature is heaven. To be the other means madness. One more time on that. All our life long, we are slowly turning either into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature, either into one that is in harmony with God or one that is in a state of war and hatred toward God. To be one kind of creature is heaven. To be the other means madness. That's C.S. Lewis. So we should be thanking Donald Trump for demolishing the madness of the United States Department of Education. Forgive my dog here. Maybe our schools can get back to teaching our students how to read and write and count, and how to pursue truth rather than rail against it. I'm Dr. Everett Piper, and this is The Rebellion.